This is a lesson that looks at AQA Paper 1, Attachment, and this lesson is to focus on the effects of institutionalisation. You can see where this sits in the specification. It fits within Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, Romanian orphan studies and effects on institutionalisation. Please ensure that you are able to do all of the ticks on this list. So, if we start off by looking at what is meant by institutionalisation. If you're a second year, we have covered this in forensic, and for first years, we have already gone through this in class. So, institutionalisation are the effects that come about from having significant institutionalised care. So, for example, being in a children's home or an orphanage. Institutionalisation looks at how time spent in an orphanage can affect the development of children. These effects can include social, mental and physical underdevelopment. Some effects may be irreversible, and I would suggest that, especially to go for higher grades in this part, what you need to focus on is really not just looking at what is meant by institutionalisation and what happens with Romanian orphans in research, but how reversible are the effects of institutionalisation. Consider by the end of this session whether you think that the effects are reversible or not, and to what extent, because you could get a to what extent question on this. We'll revisit that at the end. So, for this topic, we're going to be using the examples of Romanian orphanages. They are named on the specification, and therefore we need to cover this area. So, the events in Romania offered psychologists a chance to study separation and deprivation. In 1966, the Romanian government tried to boost population by encouraging parents to have large families and banned all abortions. What happened was that the population figures increased dramatically, and it led to some very distressing consequences, and these consequences were that children were left in orphanages for years and years and years. When we look at this, we would think this was something from the 1930s or 40s, but it actually isn't. This is from 1990. Many babies could not be cared for by their families and therefore were put into orphanages and were left and essentially grew up in an orphanage. Very harrowing to look at. The Romanian orphanages were places where children were underdeveloped and were not cared for properly. They did not have proper maternal care in any way. They would have up to 50 carers or nurses at a time. And following this, it became very clear that many of the children had stunted growth and a range of different mental and emotional problems. So, in terms of research to support this, Nelson states that a baby comes into the world expecting someone to take care of them and invest in them, and they form this bond or relationship with the caregiver. But for the Romanian orphans, there wasn't even anybody to look after them. Therefore, they've not had this initial bond. Therefore, they've missed out on forming any attachments in the critical period, and this is known as privation. This is when someone has failed to form an attachment. The first piece of research that you'll look at is not on this PowerPoint, but it is in your course booklet, and this is Rutter with the Romanian orphanages. You need to thoroughly read this research. Rutter found that children who'd been in orphanages suffered from extreme physical and mental deprivation, particularly if they were adopted after 6 months of age. When Rutter followed these up after 6 years, he found that children had not advanced upon, but had made very few improvements. One of the main things that children show is indiscriminate friendliness and what's called a disinhibited attachment. And this is where children will form friendships or treat everybody exactly the same. They do not differentiate between people at all. In psychology, disinhibition is a lack of restraint manifested in disregard for social convention, impulsivity and poor risk assessment. These are children who are quite reckless. They are children who totally disregard social norms of society and are likely to be very unpredictable. Again, please ensure that you are able to describe a disinhibited attachment style. When you've read all the material from the course booklet, you need to come to some conclusions. And the first conclusion you can make is that there is a large body of evidence to support the concept of the critical period and the importance of early intervention where children are being privated. Rutter's research is consistent with Bowlby and Harlow, suggesting that early attachments are vital. Separation from the mother early on will have disastrous consequences on later life. Have a look at Rutter's research in more detail, and you can use some of the case studies from the course booklet or from the textbook. Evidence suggests that children do have particular problems with certain areas of the brain, and the privation has very damaging effects, and this can be long term. All in all, although this is a brief video, this is just really to get you to recap and remember over the topic of institutionalisation. Remember that it could be a what extent question, so to what extent can the effects of institutionalisation be reversed? And it is to some extent if the children are adopted during the critical period of 6 months. All children who are adopted after 6 months of age are unable to form long-lasting attachments.